Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. In the last days of October 1940, thick fog covered the border between Albania and Greece, hiding an army that didn't know what was waiting for them. Thousands of Italian soldiers stood in the rain and silence, ready to invade Greece. For Mussolini, this was his chance to prove that fascist Italy was a new Rome, brave, unstoppable, and meant for greatness. But the mountains didn't care about his big dreams. They had buried empires before, and they were ready to do it again. At sunrise on October 28th, Italy's ambassador gave Greece's leaders an ultimatum, demanding the right to occupy parts of Greece to protect Italian interests. Prime Minister Yanis Metaxas, sick and weak but steady, read the paper and gave his quiet answer in French. Alors c'est la guerre. So be it. War then. When the news spread through the streets, the answer became a loud cry, "Oki," the Greek word for no. Across the country, church bells rang. Women cried, then started sewing flags. Men lined up to join the army, some wearing their father's old coats from World War I. It was like a sleeping nation woke up all at once, united not by politics but by instinct. They weren't dreaming of conquering other lands. They were fighting for something simpler but harder to destroy, the right to defend their home. As the Italians began moving forward from Albania, the weather turned against them. Rain fell without mercy, turning the mountain roads into rivers of mud. Trucks got stuck, horses died, and the proud motorized columns from Rome broke apart into small, shivering groups. Soldiers from Naples and Milan, who had never seen snow, found themselves lost in a world of rock and fog. Their maps were useless here. The Greeks knew these mountains, the deep valleys, the narrow passes, the freezing streams that could swallow a man whole. Villagers guided troops by torchlight through goat trails that outsiders couldn't see. Farmers and shepherds carried supplies on their backs. Old rifles were cleaned and given to sons who had never fired a shot in anger. Each valley became a fortress, each ridge a wall of resistance. By the 11th day, Mussolini's big attack had slowed to a crawl. Units were cut off and starving, their radios broken, their commanders shouting orders to nobody. Mussolini, still in Rome, refused to believe it. "Impossible," he said. "The Greeks are finished." But the reports got worse. His lightning war in the Balkans had turned into a huge mistake. Then came the moment that would echo across Europe. The Greeks, instead of breaking, fought back. They rushed out of the mountains and drove the invaders back across the border into Albania. For the first time in the war, an Axis army was retreating. From London to Cairo, newspaper headlines shouted in disbelief. A small nation had said no to an empire and made it real. As winter closed in, the Italians dug into the snow, cold, hungry, and embarrassed. The Greeks pushed forward, singing as they marched, their breath steaming in the mountain air. They had worse weapons, less food, but they were unstoppable. And in the fog that hung on the ridges, the echoes of their rifles rolled like thunder through history. The mountains of Epirus had awakened, and they had chosen their side. The invasion of Greece wasn't born from smart planning but from jealousy. In the autumn of 1940, Mussolini watched Hitler's lightning victories with growing anger. The swift defeat of France, the fall of Norway, the flags of Nazi Germany rising over Europe, while Italy just watched from the sidelines. Mussolini, desperate to prove himself, looked for his own conquest, one he could achieve quickly without German help. Greece, small and seemingly alone, looked like the perfect target, a victory he could claim by himself. His generals weren't sure. The army was tired from fighting in North Africa and unprepared for a mountain war. Supplies were low, equipment was old, and the roads through Albania barely worked. But in fascist Italy, hesitation was treated like treason. When Marshal Badoglio warned that the invasion was too soon, Mussolini silenced him with a sneer. "You always find a problem for every solution," he said. Pride beat reason, and the War Council approved a plan that mostly existed only on paper. Albania, the base of operations, was little more than a swamp of mud and disease. Roads were few, bridges were weak, and ports were overcrowded. Ammunition and food piled up at the docks of Durrës and Vlora, unable to move inland. The Italian high command ignored every warning. They convinced themselves that Greek morale was weak, that a single push would bring Athens to its knees within 2 weeks. "We will crush them," one officer declared, "and eat dinner in Athens by Christmas." But nobody had really studied the land they were about to invade. Northern Greece was a maze of gorges, cliffs, and narrow mountain roads that wound like veins through the Pindus Range. Tanks and trucks would be useless there. The Italians planned a campaign of movement and shock, but they were walking into a country that could swallow armies whole. Even the weather worked against them. Autumn rains turned to early snow, blocking supply routes and freezing men in their trenches before a single battle had begun. Mussolini's advisors warned him that the attack might bring British help to Greece. Greece, they argued, could serve as an Allied airbase, threatening Italy's southern border. But Mussolini brushed off the concern. "Britain is finished," he boasted. "They won't lift a finger for the Greeks." His pride demanded proof that Italy could act without Germany's shadow, proof that would soon turn into a curse. By the time the first divisions crossed the border, the entire campaign was already a failure waiting to be written. The generals were making things up as they went, the soldiers were badly equipped for the cold, and the terrain was unforgiving. What had been planned as a swift invasion was becoming a slow death march. Yet Mussolini refused to see it. He wanted headlines, not maps. In Rome, posters showed happy soldiers marching toward victory, framed by the slogan, "Per l'onore d'Italia," for the honor of Italy. But in the mountains, that honor was already bleeding into the snow. What had begun as a show of pride was turning into a lesson about arrogance. An empire trying to copy greatness but built on haste and lies. The Italian campaign into Greece began not with victory but with mud. From the first days of November 1940, the mountain roads of southern Albania melted under endless rain. Trucks got stuck, and horses slipped to their deaths on icy slopes. What Mussolini had imagined as a quick strike turned into a slow crawl through a landscape that seemed determined to swallow his army whole. The Pindus Mountains loomed ahead, steep, jagged, and unforgiving, the true enemy waiting beyond the border. In these conditions, the supplies of modern war stopped working. Food and ammunition arrived late or not at all. Soldiers marched hungry, their boots worn to rags, their coats soaked through. Columns stretched for miles along narrow trails, men pushing artillery pieces by hand when mules collapsed from exhaustion. The air smelled of wet wool, smoke, and despair. For many Italian soldiers, it was their first taste of a war where the enemy was invisible but the land itself was merciless. The few paved roads in Albania turned into rivers of mud that swallowed supply convoys whole. Bridges collapsed under the weight of passing trucks, and repair teams struggled to rebuild them in freezing rain. Commanders cursed the maps that showed roads which didn't exist, and entire divisions went missing in the fog, wandering without food or orders. When the first fights with Greek patrols came, they were brief and brutal, fought in sleet and darkness, where rifles jammed and men froze to death before the bullets reached them. Albania's people, long resentful of their Italian occupiers, offered no sympathy. Villagers closed their doors to Italian supply squads or gave them wrong directions on purpose. Some guided Greek scouts through mountain passes under the cover of night. To the locals, Mussolini's war was an outsider's foolishness, and they would do nothing to help him win it. By mid-November, the Italian advance had stopped. The few tanks they had brought couldn't climb the slopes. Artillery was useless on narrow trails, and air support was grounded by storms. The soldiers huddled in soaked trenches, firing randomly into fog that hid an enemy who seemed to vanish into the landscape. Morale began to fall apart. Letters sent home were filled with disbelief. "We were told this would be easy. It feels like a punishment." The Greek forces, in contrast, moved with purpose. They had no trucks or tanks, but they had the mountains and the will of those who lived in them. They knew where to strike, when to wait, and how to turn every ridge into a fortress. While the Italians cursed the weather, the Greeks used it like a friend, launching sudden attacks through blizzards, striking hard, then disappearing before the Italians could respond. By the end of the month, Mussolini's grand march into Greece had turned backward. The Italians weren't conquering new ground, They were fighting to stay alive in the old. The roads through Albania were no longer roads. They were graves carved into mud and snow, lined with the wreckage of an empire that had believed itself eternal. The campaign had entered its true phase, not a war of conquest but of survival. When the Italian offensive failed, the Greeks didn't pause to celebrate. They struck back with the precision of men who knew their homeland inch by inch. The counterattack began in early November as snow swept across the mountain ridges. Greek infantry, dressed in threadbare uniforms and armed with weapons older than themselves, advanced through the same terrain that had trapped the Italians. What to Rome had been an obstacle to them was a second skin. Their leadership wasn't driven by arrogance but by necessity. General Alexandros Papagos, the Greek chief of staff, organized a counterattack that seemed almost impossible on paper. He coordinated divisions scattered along impossible mountain fronts, supplied by mule trains and human endurance alone. In the frozen valleys of Epirus, the Greek army began pushing forward, quietly at first, then with growing momentum. Villagers cheered as they passed, bringing food, wine, and blankets to the men who carried their hopes on their backs. The Italians, unprepared for a retreat, fell apart in confusion. Many divisions had lost contact with their headquarters, their officers unsure whether to advance, defend, or run. What had begun as Mussolini's invasion was now becoming a rout. Greek soldiers recaptured town after town, Kalpaki, Korce, and Argyro-Castro. Each victory was marked not by parades but by exhaustion and disbelief. To them, it felt less like triumph and more like survival taking revenge. For the first time since the war began, Europe saw an Axis army in retreat. Radio Athens broadcast the news with pride but also with solemn restraint. "The struggle continues," the announcer said, "until every invader is driven out." In Britain, the BBC carried the story nightly. A small nation standing against fascism, a spark of courage in a continent of despair. Even Winston Churchill, watching from London, was moved to declare, "Henceforth, we will say that heroes fight like Greeks." On the front lines, heroism was less a choice than a routine. Soldiers marched barefoot through snow, carrying ammunition in their hands because the mules had died. Machine guns were pulled up cliffs with ropes. Artillery was hidden under pine branches to avoid detection. They fought for days without rest, guided only by instinct and the rhythm of prayer. A captured Italian officer would later write, "They fight like men who don't know they can lose." By December, the Greek flag was flying inside Albania. Mussolini's dream of empire was now measured in kilometers lost. Each valley the Italians had claimed was now a Greek fortress. The counterattack had no illusions of glory, only the grim determination to drive the invader back to where he came from. And for every step forward, the price was paid in blood and frost. The war that Mussolini had imagined as a swift campaign had transformed into something he could neither control nor understand. Italy's army was trapped in a war of slow grinding, one fought not for honor but for pride. And Greece, underestimated and under-equipped, had become the master of its own impossible victory. In the snows of Epirus, the invaders were now the hunted. The Greeks had turned defense into revenge, and the echo of their advance rolled like thunder through the valleys. A reminder that even small nations can awaken giants when pushed to the edge of survival. Winter came early to the mountains of Epirus, and with it the true face of war. By December 1940, the snow no longer fell gently. It crushed tents, buried supply lines, and froze the dead where they lay. Temperatures dropped so low that rifles jammed and breath turned to frost the moment it left a soldier's lips. Yet amid the blizzards, the Greeks kept advancing, step by step, against an enemy who had begun to crumble under the weight of his own lack of preparation. The Italian soldiers weren't cowards. They were victims of arrogance. They fought with bravery when led well, but their leaders had sent them into a death trap without food, winter clothing, or clear orders. Thousands suffered frostbite. Boots fell apart in the snow. Overcoats were made of cheap fabric that offered no warmth. Hospitals overflowed with men whose fingers had turned black and brittle. In some areas, the dead were left standing upright in the snow, frozen mid-march, their faces locked in disbelief. The Greeks faced the same storm but not the same despair. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their mountains. They had no better gear, yet they moved like ghosts through the fog. Guided by villagers who knew every hidden pass and ridge, they sang to keep their courage alive. Songs of ancient wars and the promise of spring. Priests walked among them, blessing the wounded, whispering prayers over the dying. It wasn't an army. It was a nation carried by faith and endurance. The weather became as deadly as any weapon. Avalanches buried entire battalions. Men dug trenches only to find the earth frozen solid beneath their shovels. Fires refused to light in the wind, and when they did, the smoke drew enemy artillery. The wounded froze before medics could reach them. Even the mules that carried ammunition died in rows, their bodies forming makeshift barriers against the cold. The war had become less about bullets and more about who could outlast the mountain itself. Still, the Greeks pressed on. They captured Italian outposts one by one, sometimes fighting hand-to-hand in blinding snowstorms. Reports reached Athens of entire enemy divisions surrendering, their flags buried under the ice. The victory wasn't fast, but it was complete in spirit. For every Greek soldier who fell, 10 others took his place. Behind the lines, civilians sewed uniforms and carried supplies through storms that would have frightened professional armies. The front and the homeland had become one. By Christmas, the Italians had been driven deep into Albania. Their once grand invasion now looked like retreat written in white. Mussolini's army, starving, frozen, and humiliated, clung to what was left of its line, while the Greeks stood firm in the blizzard. Across Europe, the impossible had happened. The fascist war machine had been stopped, not by a superpower but by a mountain people armed with faith, courage, and the will to endure. In the silence after each battle, the snow covered everything. Uniforms, weapons, faces. Friend and foe looked the same beneath the frost. But one truth remained visible. The Greeks had turned winter itself into a weapon. And in those mountains, it wasn't steel that decided victory. It was spirit. The Greek army that defied Mussolini wasn't modern by any standard. Its soldiers carried rifles from World War I. Its artillery dated back to the Balkan conflicts of 1912, and many of its uniforms were patched together from whatever fabric the supply officers could find. In most nations, such an army would have been dismissed as outdated. Yet in the mountains of Epirus, it became a symbol of what determination could achieve when courage replaced technology. The Greek infantrymen joked that their rifles had served their grandfathers, but they fired them with deadly accuracy. Ammunition was scarce, so every bullet counted. Men took turns sharing grenades, carrying them from trench to trench like family heirlooms. Their food was little more than bread and olives, and sometimes not even that. Yet no one complained. Letters home spoke not of fear but of pride. Pride that they had stopped an empire with little more than faith and frostbitten hands. The Italian army, in contrast, was equipped with modern weapons, tanks, artillery, and aircraft that had once terrified opponents in Ethiopia and Spain. But the Pindus Mountains were no desert, and the enemy was no helpless foe. The tanks that had rolled easily through Africa were useless on the narrow, twisting trails. They stalled, overturned, or sank into the mud. Artillery pieces were dragged up slopes only to find they couldn't angle low enough to hit anything, and the Italian Air Force, once the pride of Mussolini's regime, found itself crippled by storms and outmatched by a handful of British planes flying from Crete. The British presence in the conflict was small but decisive. Royal Air Force squadrons flew missions to protect Greek supply lines and to strike Italian positions when weather allowed. Their arrival gave the Greeks something more precious than weapons: confidence. The Allies began to see Greece as proof that fascism wasn't invincible, that even the smallest nations could fight back. The press in London and Cairo celebrated the miracle of the mountains. But those who fought there knew there was no miracle, only endurance. The Italians had assumed the Greeks would collapse within days. Instead, they met an enemy who refused to follow the script of modern war. Greek officers led charges with pistols drawn. Soldiers advanced through snowstorms without orders, and entire companies moved silently through the fog to surround positions the Italians believed impossible to reach. The discipline was rough, the tactics improvised, but the results were devastating. Mussolini's forces learned that no number of machines could match the fury of men defending their home. For the Greeks, the war became deeply personal. They fought with the faces of their families engraved in their minds. Wives, mothers, children waiting in the villages below. Every letter from home was a reminder of why they couldn't retreat. In the small stone churches that dotted the front, priests prayed for victory, their chants mixing with the rumble of distant artillery. The soldiers crossed themselves before battle and shouted, "Era! Era!" as they charged, as if calling on the wind itself to carry them forward. By the end of December 1940, the Italian army was in chaos. What Mussolini had promised as a triumph for the modern age had become a struggle against ghosts armed with old weapons. The Greeks had turned their weakness into strength, their poverty into defiance. In the hands of men who refused to surrender, even weapons of yesterday could carve a new chapter of history. By the new year of 1941, Mussolini's soldiers were fighting not only against the mountains and the cold but against the very skies above them. What had once been a symbol of fascist modernity, Italy's proud air force, had become a weakness exposed for all to see. In the valleys of Epirus and over the ridges of Albania, the heavens no longer belonged to Rome. The Italian bombers, designed for desert warfare, struggled to navigate the storms of the Balkans. Thick fog blinded pilots. Freezing winds tore at their wings, and snow clogged their engines. Entire squadrons vanished into clouds and never returned. The few that reached their targets found themselves met by a determined enemy, the Royal Air Force. From bases on Crete and in Egypt, British pilots flew missions through impossible weather, hunting Italian bombers in the blizzard skies. The RAF's precise strikes destroyed ammunition depots and supply lines that the Italians could barely afford to lose. But the greater betrayal came not from the clouds but from the invisible world of radio waves and secret codes. Unknown to Mussolini, Italian military codes had already been broken by British intelligence. The Ultra program at Bletchley Park intercepted and decoded Italy's encrypted communications, allowing the Allies to predict troop movements and bombing targets days in advance. The Greeks, guided by this intelligence, adjusted their defenses accordingly. For every Italian plan whispered in Rome, there was already an answer waiting in the mountains. The Greek anti-aircraft units, though small in number, became remarkably efficient. Using little more than outdated guns and improvised warning systems, they tracked enemy aircraft with spotlights and the sound of engines echoing through the canyons. Greek soldiers joked that even the clouds were on their side, and often it felt true. Pilots reported being unable to find their targets through the mist, while their bombs, dropped blindly, fell harmlessly into the valleys. The war that Mussolini had hoped to dominate from the air was now fought in confusion and darkness. For the Italians on the ground, the sky became a source of dread. Bombers intended to support them often missed their targets, striking friendly units instead. Messages between divisions arrived garbled or too late. Each failed attack deepened the chaos, and with every mistake, morale crumbled further. Generals argued over whose fault it was, while soldiers huddled under the frozen earth, wondering why the skies, once promised as their empire, had turned against them. Meanwhile, British reconnaissance flights photographed the Italian front with near-perfect accuracy. Their reports allowed the Greeks to strike precisely where the enemy was weakest. Italian troops joked bitterly that the British seemed to know their orders before they did. The joke, of course, was true. The illusion of fascist efficiency was falling apart, replaced by the reality of confusion, paranoia, and fear. In the myths of old, Zeus had ruled the heavens from his throne on Mount Olympus. Now it seemed that his lightning was aimed squarely at Mussolini's empire. The sky that fascism had claimed as a symbol of its technological superiority had become its executioner. Each plane that fell from the clouds, each convoy destroyed by a strike known in advance, was another reminder that modern war wasn't won by slogans or pride but by truth, by preparation, and by the will of those who refused to bow. As the winter deepened and Italy's strength withered, one truth could no longer be denied. The air that had once carried the dreams of empire now carried only smoke and defeat. The sky, once Rome's pride, had betrayed her, and the echo of that betrayal was heard all the way to Berlin. The failure in Greece wasn't born on the battlefield but in the halls of power. Inside Mussolini's regime, beneath the parades and speeches, lay a system built on fear, vanity, and lies. Mussolini ruled not through skill but through performance, surrounded by men who echoed his confidence while hiding the truth. No one dared tell him the Italian army was unprepared or that the campaign in Greece had become a disaster. Instead, reports were softened, numbers were made up, and blame was quietly passed around. Fascism had promised unity, but behind its banners, it was rotting from within. General Pietro Badoglio, once the respected chief of staff, had warned Mussolini that the invasion was reckless. The army, he said, lacked winter clothing, artillery shells, and morale. Mussolini ignored him. "The Greeks will collapse at the sight of us," he boasted. When the offensive failed, Badoglio was dismissed, replaced by General Ugo Cavallero, a man more loyal to Mussolini's pride than to military logic. Cavallero's first act wasn't to reorganize the front but to rewrite the reports, assuring Rome that the campaign was progressing steadily. The truth was buried under propaganda, and the army bled in silence. The culture of fascism turned every officer into an actor and every report into fiction. In the field, division commanders issued contradictory orders, terrified of appearing weak. In Rome, staff officers competed not to save their soldiers but to protect their reputations. The army was fighting two wars, one against Greece, the other against itself. As the front collapsed, Mussolini looked for scapegoats: the weather, the terrain, the incompetence of subordinates, never himself. To question his vision was treason. To tell him the truth was career suicide. German observers visiting the Italian front were shocked. They found radios that didn't work, supply convoys lost for days, and divisions that had received no orders for weeks. "They command by ego, not by logic," one Wehrmacht officer wrote. To Berlin, it was clear that the fascist war machine was an illusion, a pageant of uniforms and slogans covering up chaos. Even Hitler, who had once admired Mussolini, now saw him as a problem. And yet, among the soldiers themselves, courage still flickered. The Italian infantrymen fought bravely when led well. They endured hunger, frostbite, and impossible odds. But no amount of bravery could overcome the incompetence above them. Letters from the front reveal the growing bitterness. "We are sent to die for a photograph. The generals care only for medals and speeches." The spirit of the army was breaking, not because it lacked courage but because it lacked purpose. In the marble halls of Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini paced beneath portraits of Caesars, dictating speeches about destiny while his troops starved in the snow. He couldn't see that his empire was collapsing not from enemy fire but from its own decay. Every order he issued became another crack in the foundation, another proof that fascism wasn't strength but theater. The generals obeyed out of fear. The soldiers fought out of duty. And somewhere between the two, the dream of a new Rome dissolved into farce. By February 1941, the reality was undeniable. The Italian army was trapped, demoralized, and falling apart. Officers falsified victories to preserve their careers. Mussolini responded by demanding another offensive, as if words could create miracles. The empire he had built on pride was rotting faster than he could pretend otherwise. In Greece, the mountains were merciless. In Rome, the lies were worse. The war had revealed not the strength of fascism but its hollowness. Mussolini, once hailed as the man who made the trains run on time, now commanded a nation that couldn't even supply its own soldiers. Italy had gone to war chasing the ghost of Caesar and found only the echo of decay. While Mussolini's empire cracked beneath its own vanity, Greece seemed to grow stronger the longer the war dragged on. The deeper the winter, the harder the resistance. It was as if hardship itself had become the country's fuel. In Athens and Thessaloniki, the streets buzzed with volunteers, songs, and whispered prayers. For the first time in generations, the divisions that had torn Greek society apart, royalists and republicans, rich and poor, city and mountain, began to fade before a single truth. They were all Greeks, and Greece was fighting for its life. At the center of this fragile unity stood Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas, a man often misunderstood by history. Before the war, he had ruled as an authoritarian, dissolving parliament and censoring the press. Yet when the invasion came, even his opponents recognized his resolve. He became the reluctant symbol of defiance. Sickly and frail, confined to his bed during the crucial weeks of battle, he ruled through telegrams and midnight meetings. "You must hold," he told his generals. "Even if Athens burns, Greece must live." His death in January 1941 turned him into a national martyr, the dictator who had become the father of resistance. Beyond the capital, the war was carried on the backs of ordinary people. Women in mountain villages spun wool for uniforms and carried ammunition up the slopes when trucks couldn't. Children helped lead the mules that supplied the front. Priests blessed departing soldiers, and church bells rang whenever word arrived of another victory. The newspapers, though heavily censored, printed poems and letters from the front, humble, proud, and unbroken. In one, a soldier wrote, "We fight for the mountains, for the light of our villages, for the smell of the olive trees. If we lose them, what are we?" British and Australian reporters who reached the Greek lines described a kind of morale they had never seen. There was exhaustion, yes, and grief, but not despair. Around campfires, soldiers spoke of their ancestors as if they were still among them. Leonidas at Thermopylae, Kolokotrones of the Revolution, the ghosts of every war fought to keep Greece alive. For them, this wasn't merely another front in a global conflict. It was the continuation of an ancient promise that no foreign tyrant would ever claim their land without a fight. The Greek Orthodox Church became the soul of this defiance. Its icons traveled to the front, carried in metal cases beside rifles and grenades. Soldiers prayed before battle, crossing themselves in the snow. When news spread of the sinking of the Greek cruiser Ellie months earlier, torpedoed by an Italian submarine during a religious festival, the nation remembered it not as a tragedy but as prophecy. The Virgin Mary, they said, had already chosen sides. As the war stretched into the new year, hunger and frost tightened their grip. Yet the Greeks refused to yield. Even in occupied towns, resistance simmered quietly. Villagers fed scouts, farmers hid deserters, and families sheltered the wounded on both sides. To surrender was unthinkable. "We have no choice," one general said. "If Greece falls, we cease to exist." While Mussolini's Rome drowned in self-delusion, Greece, battered, hungry, and half-frozen, discovered something the fascists could never manufacture: conviction. Their weapons were outdated, their army small, their allies distant. But their unity, born not of propaganda but of purpose, had become unbreakable. The heart of the nation beat louder than the bombs above it. And every echo from the mountains carried a single word that had come to define an entire people: Oki. No to surrender, no to fear, no to empire. As the front froze into stalemate, faith became the last weapon the Greeks could use. Their faith wasn't blind optimism but something older, carved into the stone of their history, the belief that survival itself was sacred. In the trenches and mountain caves, icons of the Virgin Mary stood beside machine guns, their painted faces dimly lit by candles flickering in the icy wind. Soldiers kissed them before battle, whispering prayers that blurred into the sound of artillery. For many, the war had become not just a defense of their homeland but a holy act, a war of necessity made sacred by suffering. Greek chaplains marched with the troops, carrying crosses instead of rifles, tending to the wounded and burying the dead beneath the snow. They heard confessions in the dark, prayed over the dying, and sang hymns that echoed across the mountains like distant bells. When morale faltered, they reminded the men that their struggle was older than Mussolini, older even than Rome, that Greece had always been a nation of resurrection. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The same land where ancient gods had once stood now bore witness to a new kind of faith, one that fused religion with endurance. Meanwhile, the Italian propaganda machine tried to twist the story. Radio broadcasts from Rome promised the soldiers that the Greeks were deluded fanatics, their resistance a temporary miracle doomed to collapse. But for the men on the ground, no lie could hide what they saw. the Italians faced an enemy who prayed not for victory but for meaning. Each Greek counterattack launched with the cry of "Era" felt less like a military maneuver and more like an invocation, a shout that broke through fear and reminded every man why he fought. In the villages behind the lines, the war had turned into a kind of pilgrimage. Women carried supplies to the front as if fulfilling vows. Priests led processions through snow-covered streets, asking for divine protection for the soldiers in the mountains. Churches stayed open all night, their doors glowing in the darkness, where people gathered to sing hymns until dawn. Faith wasn't an escape from the war. It was the thread that bound every act of endurance. Even foreign observers were struck by it. British correspondents wrote that the Greek soldiers moved like men who felt history watching them. To the outside world, their courage was romantic. To the Greeks themselves, it was survival dressed in faith. "We don't pray for easy days," one officer wrote, "but for strength to meet the hard ones." The snow buried everything: uniforms, trenches, even the bodies of the fallen. But the fires that burned in the hearts of those who remained refused to die. By February 1941, the front had gone silent under blizzards. But the silence was deceptive. Every mountain pass the Greeks held, every ridge defended against impossible odds, spoke of something Mussolini's army could never understand. For fascism, war was a theater for pride. For Greece, it was a crucible for the soul. And in that crucible, through frost and fire, the Greeks forged something that no empire could conquer: belief. By early March 1941, Mussolini's patience and his pride had reached their breaking point. The Greek counteroffensive had embarrassed Italy before the entire world. German newspapers mocked his failure, calling the campaign a blunder in the mountains. Determined to reclaim his image, Mussolini decided to lead a renewed offensive in person. He would show his generals, his soldiers, and above all Hitler, that Italy could still fight like an empire. The operation was given a grand name: Primavera, the Spring Offensive. But in the mountains of Epirus, spring had not yet come. The plan was simple and suicidal. Italian artillery would bombard Greek positions across the Kalpaki front, softening them for a full infantry assault. Mussolini himself would watch from a marble observation post built especially for his arrival, complete with cameras to record his triumph. On March 9th, the bombardment began. For 6 hours, the sky roared with fire. More than 100,000 shells fell on the Greek lines, shaking the valleys and setting the forests ablaze. Then, when the smoke cleared, the infantry advanced, and the Greeks, waiting in silence, opened fire. The Italians attacked with bravery but no strategy. Their soldiers charged uphill against machine guns, slipping on melting snow, shouting for Il Duce, before falling in waves. Greek defenders, dug into stone trenches, fought with mechanical precision. When the Italians reached the wire, they were cut down by rifles and grenades. For 15 days, the offensive raged across the same ridges that had already swallowed so many lives. Every attempt to break through ended in ruin. The Italian army was fighting the same war twice and losing both times. Mussolini, wrapped in a fur coat and surrounded by aides, watched the disaster unfold through his binoculars. Generals whispered excuses: the weather, the terrain, the enemy's stubbornness. But no one could hide the truth. His presence changed nothing. His troops fought bravely, but for him, not with him. He wrote in his diary that evening, "The Greeks fight like demons. The men are exhausted. The mountains are cruel." Yet still, he refused to stop. Pride, once wounded, had become obsession. As the offensive collapsed, Mussolini ordered his photographers to keep filming, to capture what he called the courage of the Italian spirit. In Rome, propaganda reels showed smiling soldiers and banners waving in the wind, while in the mountains, the wounded lay in frozen silence. It was the final irony of fascism, a regime built on image, reduced to documenting its own failure. When the spring offensive ended, it had gained nothing but graves. For the Greeks, the victory came at a cost they could barely afford. Thousands lay dead or frostbitten. Ammunition was running out, rations were gone, and their supply lines were stretched to breaking. Yet morale didn't collapse. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that even the earth seemed to reject the invaders. One survivor of the bombardment recalled, "We thought the mountains would split apart, but when the fire stopped, we were still here. We knew then we couldn't be moved." Mussolini returned to Rome in silence, escorted through streets lined with troops who avoided his gaze. His grand gesture had only deepened Italy's humiliation, and as his armies bled in the mountains, Hitler, now watching closely, decided that the time had come for Germany to step in. What Mussolini had begun as a quest for glory was about to drag the entire Axis deeper into the war. The empire had struck back and shattered itself in the process. As Mussolini's army froze and faltered, another power stirred to the north. Adolf Hitler had watched the Greek campaign with growing irritation. What had been a minor distraction was now a strategic disaster. The Italian failure had forced Germany's hand. To secure the Balkans before launching his grand invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler needed the southern flank stable, and that meant rescuing his ally from the consequences of his pride. In March 1941, the order went out, Operation Marita, the German invasion of Greece. In Berlin's war rooms, the plan was clinical and cold. German divisions would sweep through Bulgaria, bypassing the mountains where the Italians had gotten stuck, and strike deep into Greek territory. The objective wasn't glory but efficiency: crush resistance, occupy the mainland, and open the path to Crete and the Aegean. For the Greeks, exhausted after 5 months of war, this new threat was like thunder on the horizon. Distant at first, then overwhelming. On March 25, Yugoslavia, pressured by Germany to join the Axis, erupted in rebellion. The coup enraged Hitler. Within days, he ordered Yugoslavia invaded as well, binding both nations' fates together. When German tanks crossed the borders in early April, they moved with mechanical precision. Roads, bridges, communications, all destroyed in hours. The same Wehrmacht that had crushed France now rolled through the Balkans, unstoppable. The Italians followed in their shadow, pretending to lead a campaign they no longer controlled. The Greeks, though exhausted, didn't surrender easily. Their troops held firm in the Albanian mountains even as the new threat appeared behind them. General Papagos pleaded with his government to withdraw to a defensible line, but political pride and Allied promises delayed the order until it was too late. British and Commonwealth forces began landing on Greek soil, Australians, New Zealanders, and Britons sent to help a doomed defense. They were brave but too few. The line that had held Mussolini's army couldn't withstand Hitler's. On April 6, the German assault began. The Blitz came like lightning, tanks roaring down mountain roads, dive bombers screaming from the sky. Greek soldiers fought with the same courage as before, but now they were outmatched in every possible way. Machine guns against armor, rifles against aircraft. The mountains that had once protected them now trapped them. Towns burned, bridges fell, and columns of refugees wound through the valleys as the German army advanced faster than anyone thought possible. In Athens, the air raid sirens became a grim lullaby. British planes fought desperate rearguard actions over the capital as the population watched the sky darken with the silhouettes of enemy bombers. The Greek flag still flew above the Acropolis, fluttering defiantly in the smoke. "We're fighting for honor now," one officer said. "Nothing else is left." His words would soon prove true. By mid-April, the Greek front disintegrated. The army that had humiliated Italy was surrounded, cut off from supply, and collapsing under relentless air attacks. Even in defeat, their resistance impressed the Germans. Field Marshal List, commanding the invasion, wrote in his diary, "They fought to the last cartridge. It wasn't surrender, it was exhaustion." The eagle of the Reich had spread its shadow over the Balkans, and the light of Greek defiance, though dimmed, still burned. On April 27, German troops entered Athens. The swastika was raised above the Parthenon. Yet even as it fluttered in the wind, it looked wrong, alien, temporary. Those who saw it whispered that it wouldn't stay forever. Greece had fallen but not broken. The war of armies was over. The war of spirit was only beginning. The morning Athens fell was eerily quiet. No cheering, no speeches, only the echo of boots on marble streets. On April 27, 1941, German motorcyclists rolled through the city's ancient gates, their helmets gleaming beneath a clouded sky. Civilians watched from shuttered windows as columns of Wehrmacht soldiers marched past the ruins of their history. For the first time in 3,000 years, the birthplace of democracy had fallen under foreign occupation. Atop the Acropolis, a German officer ordered the Nazi flag raised. The black swastika unfurled beside the Parthenon, a sight so obscene that witnesses wept in silence. One young Greek soldier, Evzon Konstantinos Koukidis, refused to surrender the Greek flag he had guarded throughout the siege. According to legend, he wrapped himself in it and leapt from the Acropolis to his death rather than see it replaced. Whether myth or truth, the story spread like wildfire through the city, becoming the first act of defiance under occupation. The German commanders were efficient, clinical. Their orders were to maintain discipline, preserve order, and extract resources. Athens was too symbolic to destroy. It would be displayed as a trophy of the Reich's power. Yet beneath the calm, an undercurrent of rage and despair ran through the population. The citizens who had once shouted "Oki," with pride now whispered it in secret. For them, survival had become the new resistance. The Italians followed the Germans into the capital, parading as if victory were theirs. But the people knew better. The same soldiers who had fled the mountains now strutted through the streets they could never have conquered alone. The Greek press, now under Axis control, printed stories of liberation. But every reader understood the lie. Behind the facades of propaganda, Athens starved. The food reserves were gone, the ports under blockade. Within weeks, the city of marble and light was reduced to hunger and shadow. Across the country, the army that had once fought in Albania laid down its arms. Many soldiers, refusing to surrender to the Italians, walked home through the mountains rather than hand over their rifles. Some buried their weapons beneath olive trees, swearing to retrieve them one day. Others fled to Crete or the Middle East, where British forces were regrouping. Even in defeat, the instinct to resist remained alive, quiet but unbroken. The occupation divided Greece into zones: German, Italian, and Bulgarian. Each brought its own brand of cruelty. In the north, villages were burned. In the islands, partisans were hunted. In the cities, hunger became a weapon. Thousands died in the famine of 1941–42, a silent catastrophe that claimed more lives than the fighting itself. Yet amid the suffering, a new kind of war began. One not fought by armies but by ordinary men and women who refused to accept defeat. When night fell over Athens, the people turned off their lamps to avoid the patrols. In the darkness, someone would begin to sing. An old folk tune, or a hymn, or a whispered verse of the national anthem, and others would join, quietly at first, then louder. It was dangerous, but it was something the occupiers couldn't silence. Even under the shadow of the swastika, Greece was learning how to fight again, not with guns but with memory. When Athens fell, the war for mainland Greece was over, but its spirit retreated to the islands. Crete, the jewel of the Aegean, became the last bastion of Greek and Allied resistance. The island's rocky ridges and olive groves were now crowded with British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek troops. Many evacuated from the mainland under fire. Exhausted, short of weapons, and with little air cover, they waited for the inevitable. The Germans were coming, and this time they would strike from the sky. Hitler's generals warned him against the operation. Crete was heavily defended, the terrain brutal for paratroopers. But the Führer saw it as a test, a demonstration of German supremacy before the invasion of Russia. The plan, Operation Mercury, would unleash more than 20,000 airborne troops on the island, the largest airborne invasion in history. On May 20, 1941, the morning sky over Crete darkened with gliders and parachutes. Villagers looked up in awe and terror as the air filled with the hum of engines and the sound of falling men. The Germans landed expecting to face a disorganized retreat. Instead, they met a storm of bullets. Allied troops, guided by civilians, fired from every ridge and olive grove. Farmers attacked paratroopers with hunting rifles, axes, and even stones. In the town of Heraklion, Priests blessed villagers who charged German positions with whatever they could find. The Luftwaffe responded with brutal precision, bombing towns, fields, and even hospitals. Within hours, Crete had become a battlefield unlike any other in the war, an island fighting with every stone, every hand, every breath. The battle raged for 10 days. The Germans paid dearly for every kilometer. Thousands of their elite paratroopers lay dead among the olive trees, their silk shoots tangled in the branches. The Allies fought with courage, but the skies belonged to Germany. Without air superiority, supply lines broke and positions fell one by one. On May 27th, British General Bernard Freyberg ordered the evacuation. It was the same grim ritual that had followed Dunkirk in Greece, brave men retreating from impossible odds. Yet even in retreat, Crete's defenders left behind a legend that would echo for decades. The occupation of Crete was cruel beyond measure. The Germans, enraged by the civilian resistance, executed entire villages in reprisal. Yet the Cretans never stopped fighting. From the mountains, partisans struck back again and again, aided by the British Special Operations Executive. Shepherds became saboteurs, farmers became spies, and priests hid Allied pilots in monasteries. In Crete, resistance wasn't a movement, it was life itself. Hitler, shaken by the heavy casualties, swore that he would never again use paratroopers on such a scale. The victory had come at too high a cost. For the Greeks, that was enough. They had lost their island but not their soul. The legend of Crete joined that of Marathon, Thermopylae, and the Albanian front, proof that courage could outlive conquest. When the last Allied ships disappeared over the horizon, those who remained on the island stood among the ruins, watching the sea shimmer with the light of dawn. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and conquered. Yet they didn't kneel. For them, the war was no longer about survival. It had become a covenant that Greece, even in defeat, would never forget how to stand. By the summer of 1941, Greece had vanished from the maps of freedom. The occupiers divided the spoils like scavengers. The Germans took the cities and the key ports. The Bulgarians seized Macedonia and Thrace. The Italians were given the rest, the mountains, the islands, the heart of the land. Yet this partition only deepened the suffering. Where once the Greek people had fought invaders face to face, they now faced an enemy without mercy, hunger, fear, and silence. The famine began slowly, then all at once. The German requisition stripped villages bare, seizing grain, livestock, and olive oil for export. The blockade by the British Navy, meant to weaken the Axis, instead strangled the occupied population. By winter, Athens had become a city of ghosts. Children begged for bread that didn't exist. Bodies lay on the sidewalks, covered in newspapers to hide the shame of starvation. It was said that in those months even the crows disappeared. There was nothing left for them to eat. The Italians ruled their zones with arrogance but little discipline. Some officers tried to maintain order. Others plundered shamelessly. The Germans were colder, efficient, calculated, cruel. They executed hostages for acts of resistance, burned villages suspected of aiding partisans, and filled prisons with poets, priests, and teachers. The conquerors claimed to bring order, but what they built was despair. And yet beneath that despair, something began to stir. The same mountains that had once sheltered armies now hid something smaller and more dangerous: fragments of resistance. Former soldiers, students, and peasants began to organize in secret. They gathered weapons buried since the surrender, spread underground newspapers, and whispered slogans in the dark: freedom or death. From the ruins of defeat, Greece was beginning to breathe again. In the cities, defiance took quieter forms. Workers sabotaged machinery. Women smuggled food through checkpoints. And teachers taught forbidden lessons, not of war but of hope. In one school, children recited the ancient words of Solon and Pericles, forbidden by the occupiers but remembered by heart. "You can occupy our streets," one teacher told her class, "but you can't occupy our memory." The occupiers understood nothing of this defiance. They saw a broken country easy to control. But to the Greeks, every stolen loaf, every hidden flag, Every whispered hymn was a battle. It wasn't the war of nations anymore. It was the war of the soul. The same people who had said "Oki" to Mussolini now said it again, quietly, to every soldier who passed their door. By the end of 1941, the land lay in ruin. But the spirit that had once driven the Greeks to fight in the mountains of Epirus had not died. It had simply changed form. Where armies had failed, memory would now resist. And in that memory, the dream of freedom waited, patient, fierce, and eternal. By 1942, the famine had killed more Greeks than the war itself. The streets of Athens echoed not with marching boots but with the rattle of empty carts collecting the dead. Yet amid the hunger and humiliation, something began to shift. Out of starvation grew fury, and from fury came purpose. Small groups of men and women, soldiers left behind, workers, farmers, and students, began to gather in the shadows. Their goal was no longer to survive, it was to fight back. At first, the resistance was barely more than whispers and scattered acts of defiance. A German truck sabotaged here, a bridge bombed there, a leaflet dropped in a square. But these acts carried power far beyond their scale. The occupiers could conquer the land, but not the idea that Greece could rise again. In the mountains of central Greece, a former officer named Eris Volokiotis began forming guerrilla bands, the ELAS, the Greek People's Liberation Army. They wore stolen uniforms, carried mismatched weapons, and lived like ghosts among the rocks. From the forests of Thessaly, they built a network of invisible war. In the cities, another kind of resistance took shape. The EAM, the National Liberation Front, spread underground, connecting workers, teachers, and priests in secret cells. Their tools were printing presses and whispers, not guns. They smuggled food to starving families, hid Jews from deportation, and wrote slogans on the walls at night, Eleftheria I Thanatos, freedom or death. The occupation authorities responded with terror, rounding up civilians, torturing suspected partisans, and burning entire villages. But repression only fed the fire. The British soon made contact with the resistance through agents of the Special Operations Executive. Parachuted supplies, radios, and advisors began to appear in the mountains. The Allies saw Greece as a small but vital front, a thorn in the Axis flank. To the Greeks themselves, it was more than strategy. It was the return of faith that the world had not forgotten them. "We are not alone," a partisan leader wrote. "The mountains speak again." The Germans responded with brutal reprisals. For every attack on a convoy, they executed hostages. For every bridge destroyed, they burned a village. Yet the resistance only grew. In September 1942, the partisans achieved their first great victory, the sabotage of the Gorgopotamos Bridge. British and Greek commandos blew up the vital railway line connecting Thessaloniki to Athens, crippling Axis supply routes to North Africa. The explosion was seen for miles, and for the first time since the occupation began, Greeks danced in the dark. In the villages, the resistance fighters became both legends and ghosts, appearing suddenly, striking hard, then vanishing into the hills. Songs were written about them, whispered at night over meager fires. "They come like thunder," one villager said, "and vanish like the wind." For every fallen partisan, another took his place. It was no longer a matter of winning battles. It was about keeping the flame alive. By the end of 1942, the occupiers still controlled the cities, the ports, and the skies. But the mountains, the eternal mountains, belonged once again to Greece. The same ridges that had witnessed the defeat of Mussolini now sheltered the rebirth of rebellion. What had begun as a war of empires had become a war of ghosts and whispers, and those whispers were turning into a roar. By 1943, the war in Greece had entered its second life. The occupiers still ruled the cities, but the countryside was slipping from their grasp. Across the mountains, partisans carved out liberated zones where the Greek flag flew again, ragged and defiant, stitched from torn bedsheets and blood. The resistance had become a nation within a nation, one that survived without orders, supply lines, or government, only conviction. The ELAS fighters, hardened by hunger and snow, moved through the forests like shadows. They ambushed convoys, cut telephone lines, and destroyed bridges under moonlight. Each act of sabotage brought savage reprisals. Entire villages burned, hostages executed, fields salted with ash. But each act of vengeance only made the movement stronger. "They kill 10 and we rise with 100, one partisan commander said. "Because they fight for orders, we fight for tomorrow." The Germans and Italians now waged a campaign of terror to break the will of the people. In the north, the village of Camino was erased in a single morning, its men, women, and children shot as punishment for sheltering resistance fighters. In Crete, the mountain villages of Vianos and Anogia were burned to the ground. The flames lit the night sky like a grim aurora, a warning written in fire. Yet instead of fear, these massacres sowed rage. The songs of mourning became songs of vengeance. The Italians, already demoralized, began to crumble. When Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, their occupation forces in Greece disintegrated overnight. Some Italian soldiers joined the partisans. Others were executed by their former German allies. The balance of power shifted again, and the German response was swift and merciless. Elite SS divisions poured into the mountains, determined to crush the resistance once and for all. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in days. But the partisans had already melted away, waiting for the next chance to strike. In the chaos, old divisions within Greece began to resurface. The resistance wasn't a single movement but a collection of rival visions. Communist, royalist, nationalist, united only by the shared hatred of the occupier. As victory began to seem possible, unity began to crack. Skirmishes between factions grew, secret meetings turned into rival governments, and rumors of betrayal spread through the camps. Even as they fought the Axis, the Greeks were beginning to fear each other. Still, through the infighting and the blood, one truth endured: the occupiers no longer owned the night. Every convoy that rolled into the mountains did so with fear in its headlights. German patrols carried flamethrowers, not for combat but for terror. Yet in the end, terror wasn't enough. The mountains had devoured Mussolini's dream, and now they were swallowing Hitler's. By late 1943, the German forces held only the roads and cities. Everything else belonged to the ghosts. In the deep valleys of Epirus, the same ridges where the war had begun now echoed again with gunfire and song. The Greeks were fighting not just to survive the occupation but to reclaim their story. Out of fire, famine, and betrayal, they had forged something indestructible: the will to exist as a free people. In those mountains where so many had fallen, the war no longer felt like history in motion. It felt like destiny repeating itself, the ancient promise of a small nation forever saying no to those who would command it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1944, Greece was unrecognizable. Its cities lay in ruins, its villages burned, its people starved. Yet its soul remained unbroken. Liberation came not as a parade, but as a whisper carried down from the mountains. The Germans are leaving. In Athens, the occupiers marched out the same way they had come, in silence. But the people didn't cheer. Too many had died. Too much had been lost. The joy of freedom was tempered by grief and exhaustion. The resistance fighters descended from the highlands, lean and scarred, greeted as heroes by some and as rivals by others. Years of occupation had blurred the lines between unity and ideology. Britain supported the royalists. The communists, who had carried much of the burden of resistance, demanded their share of power. Old wounds reopened, and within months, Greece, the nation that had defied two empires, was on the edge of civil war. What had begun as a struggle for liberation now risked becoming a struggle for the nation's soul. But even amid that turmoil, the legacy of 1940 endured. The day Metaxas had said no, Oki, had become a sacred date, celebrated every October 28th as a testament to courage. It wasn't the victory that defined Greece but the refusal to surrender. Across Europe, even enemies had come to admire that defiance. Hitler himself admitted that if his troops had not been delayed in Greece, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, might have succeeded before the Russian winter. Whether or not that was true, the myth carried its own kind of truth. Greece had reminded the world that willpower could shape destiny. In the years that followed, Greece rebuilt, slowly, painfully. The ruins of war became schools. The mountains that had once hidden partisans became silent monuments. The children who had starved during the occupation grew up with stories of their parents' defiance. And each generation after would learn that word, oki, not just as history but as inheritance. It was no longer just a refusal, it was a promise that Greece would always stand, even when standing meant bleeding. The memory of those winters, the frostbitten soldiers, starving families, and the flag over the Acropolis, became more than a chapter in history. It became a mirror in which Greece saw its truest reflection. The world had moved on. Empires had fallen. But the spirit that once said no to tyranny continued to echo through the stones, the songs, and the hearts of its people. When the veterans of that war grew old, they said little of glory. They spoke instead of endurance, of the cold, the hunger, the comrades who never came home. One Greek officer, standing before a classroom years later, told his students, "We didn't win because we were strong. We won because we couldn't imagine being anything else." Today, when the church bells ring on Oki Day and the blue and white flags ripple in the autumn wind, it's not just a commemoration. It's a conversation between the past and the present, between those who stood in the snow and those who remember why. The mountains of Epirus are quiet now, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that one word that changed everything, Oki.